although black students were admitted to some white colleges, notably Oberlin, Bowdoin, Hillsdale, and Western Reserve. Even before the Civil War, most postbellum black students pursued their higher education at the black colleges until the 1960s. In the decades that followed, up to the present, the majority of black students have attended predominantly white colleges. Given the scarcity of black students with the educational background and academic achievements common among other students at the predominantly white colleges, these institutions' desires to secure a demographically representative student body made lower standards of admissions for blacks virtually inevitable. This problem was not confined to colleges with very high academic standards. When top-tier colleges and universities accepted black students who met the normal qualifications for second-tier institutions, similar pressures led second-tier institutions to accept black students who would normally qualify for third-tier colleges and universities, and so on down the line. With black students systematically mismatched with academic institutions across the spectrum, it can hardly be surprising that most black students nationwide failed to graduate. Such negative educational results repeated a pattern of bad educational results from making educational decisions on non-educational grounds that began with the creation of black colleges that were colleges in name only in the 19th century, for the sake of denominational rivalry, and later putting underqualified people in charge of these black colleges for the sake of racial representation. Very similar corrupting and anti-intellectual consequences have followed latter-day educational policies based on demographic representation. Moreover, these consequences have endured, even through turnovers of students and faculty over the years. The admission of black students with qualifications markedly lower than those of the other students at the same institutions was soon followed by hiring black faculty members with qualifications likewise lower than those of their white and Asian faculty colleagues. This was done for the same reason, namely, that there were simply not enough blacks with the usual academic qualifications to achieve demographic representation any other way. Not only are there far fewer black students than Asian American students who reach the usual test score levels found at selective colleges, this shortfall is even more drastic at the postgraduate level, where future faculty members are produced. In some years, the absolute numbers of blacks receiving PhDs in mathematics did not reach double digits. There is a particularly painful irony in the notion that blacks who are seeking to become educated are acting white. During Frederick Law Olmsted's celebrated journeys through the antebellum South, he was appalled to learn that a free black man had been publicly whipped in Washington, D.C. for conducting a clandestine school for black children. Not only was it illegal to teach slaves to read and write, it was illegal in many places for free blacks to go to school. Yet clandestine schools for black children existed all over the South, some of which were ignored by the local authorities, though not by all, as this courageous black man discovered in Washington. What a mockery of him and other courageous black pioneers to say that seeking an education is acting white. Despite bans on education for blacks in the antebellum South, and by no means universal access of blacks to public schools in the North, the census of 1850 showed that most of the approximately 500,000 free blacks could read and write. After emancipation, the achievement of literacy by a majority of black Americans within 2 generations has been called an accomplishment seldom witnessed in human history by a noted economic historian. Literacy may be something that we take for granted today, but most of the people in Albania were still illiterate in the 1920s. And most of the people in India were still illiterate half a century after that. But how and why literacy was achieved among black Americans as rapidly as it was is a matter of little or no interest to those who treat the history of blacks as the history of white people's treatment of blacks. Thus, the history of the education of blacks in the United States is presented largely as a history of segregated schools, starved for funds, and of biases against black students by white teachers, or by white students in racially integrated settings, or other such things which transform the history of black people into a history of white people in their treatment of blacks. History is too often the handmaiden of contemporary visions or agendas. Accomplishments among blacks are often either magnified or downplayed, or glided over entirely, according to whether these accomplishments do or do not advance the agenda of portraying victimhood or struggles against victimhood. In this context, it is explicable, though hardly justified, that the history of successful black schools has attracted virtually no interest from either historians or educators. That history does not advance any contemporary political agenda, though it might help advance the education of a whole generation of black students. Things that do advance contemporary agendas include demands for money to promote the teaching of Black English or Ebonics. Here, there is much appeal to history, though largely a fictitious history. The peculiarities of ghetto speech, often imitated even among contemporary black middle-class youth, are said to derive from African speech patterns, when in fact, most of those very same words and phrases were part of the speech patterns in those parts of Britain from which white Southerners came centuries ago. False history is not unique to black Americans. As Daniel Patrick Moynihan said of his fellow Irish Americans, "The cruel part of this history is that by 1916, Irish nationalism in America had little to do with Ireland. It was a hodgepodge of fine feeling and bad history with which the immigrants filled a cultural void." Much of what calls itself Afrocentric education is similarly remote from Africa and is similarly filling a cultural void. But now, there is huge political support for such things, and that has brought forth large amounts of money to subsidize these escapisms. Moreover, these are now regarded as sacrosanct parts of black culture, which insulates them from inquiries into either their authenticity or their educational consequences.